It's such a privilege today to be able to speak with Merav Michaeli, who is a new member of Knesset from the Labor Party, elected last year in a wave of new people, especially quite a few women, to the Knesset. Merav came to the parliament, to Israel's parliament, after a long and illustrious career in journalism, in broadcasting, doing writing for Haaretz, documentation, film, all sorts of things like that. And we're going to talk today about her career, her family, her views on what's going on in Israel, and in particular, the work that she has done really for her entire life to promote gender equity in Israeli society, in Jewish life, and beyond. So please join me in welcoming Merav Michaeli.
Thank you so very much, Jane, for this amazing introduction. I'm afraid that Israelis don't really realize the extent to which the American Jewish community is relevant to our lives in Israel. And it's really, for me, a sheer pleasure to be here. And thank you so very much for having me.
Thank you. Let's sort of begin at the beginning in terms of your Knesset career. Why did you decide to run for this very difficult job? And especially at a time when politics is really a stressful occupation, not always a satisfying one. Why did you leave this amazing perch that you had in journalism and broadcasting to do this?
First of all, I have to say that it is satisfying. Dafka, if you know this word that English misses, it's very satisfying. And I don't know that I ever decided to get into politics. I just did at some point. But when I was hesitating, and there were 6 weeks in which I was practically only hesitating whether to go or not to go into politics, over which I lost many pounds, which unfortunately I regained. And my biggest worry was, can you really make an impact from the inside, at least as much as I managed to do from the outside? Because you mentioned my career on the media, which I was very proud of and very engaged in, and did a lot of things that really were a lot of joy to do. But I had a parallel career in activism. I always said I had a parallel career in feminism. Working since '95, I was working for the rape crisis centers and for every other feminist cause, and gradually went into peace organizations, working for what so far has not been very successful towards reaching a peace agreement between us and our neighbors. And afterwards involved in many social issues such as work relations and workers' rights, etc., etc. So I was a sort of an enterprise of activism, doing my own stuff, on my own terms. And since I was very famous from a very early age, and I was very well networked and could really facilitate a lot of stuff. So I was really, my biggest worry was, will it be worth it becoming a politician, something that's really suffers from such a bad image, when in fact, I am amazed by the gap between the actual work and the image of it, but we can discuss it later. So I think my biggest maybe answer after a year is this big yes. If only for the 2 laws that I have already passed. One will be finalized when I come back and Knesset reconvenes. If only for those 2 laws, it was already worth it. What are they? One is a law that is giving much more money for Holocaust survivors, but not from the state's budget, but from whatever. It's a company that regained assets that were gone during the Holocaust, and now no one is claiming them, so at least the money should go to the survivors. So this is one law. And the other is, Israel was apparently the last democracy that allowed people to go to jail for civil debt even if they didn't have the money. So my law abolishes that possibility, and there will be no more jailing for civil debt in Israel as of very soon. So if it was only for that, really, it's so worth it. I mean, and that is in the opposition, you know, so.
So, you know, there's a tradition in the Knesset where new members make a maiden speech. And I'm not sure whether it's just because of our technological age or YouTube or whatever, but somehow these maiden speeches in the Knesset that began in 2013 really have had amazing impact. Certainly, many of you, I'm sure, heard Ruth Calderon speak from the Yesh Atid party, and I absolutely recommend that if you have not already, that you go online after this and listen to Merav's talk about what she brought to this body, what she's hoping to accomplish. And the question I have to ask you about is your family, because you position yourself as part of what you call a founding dynasty, or you said a dynasty of doing things differently. Why don't you tell the audience about that?
Okay, so first of all, I want to acknowledge the grandfather I'm referring to in my speech is Rejo Kastner, whom I will speak about in a second, but I want to acknowledge my living grandfather. He's the Michaeli one who came from Poland before the war. And he's one of those who really built the state of Israel, really, you know, was planting and making roads and really doing the work of the actual building. And he's a socialist, always have been. So I came from this home was a political home, even though it skipped a generation. My father's like, just looked the other way most of his life. And the other grandfather, who's Rejo Kastner, who maybe some of you heard his name, was a Hungarian Zionist in Budapest during the Holocaust. And he was involved, I wouldn't say, he actually rescued at least 20,000 Jews. That is what Yad Vashem is already recognizing. The research talks about many, many more people that he rescued, and he rescued them through negotiating with Eichmann. Negotiating with Eichmann and working with other Nazi officers who realized they need an alibi for the post-war and needed money and whatever they wanted to achieve. He was able to take advantage of and actually bring to the rescue of so many Jews. And then he made Aliyah 2 years after the war, and he was a Zionist, a member of Mapai party, and was about to become a member of Knesset, working for the government and being a journalist on Új Kelet, the Hungarian newspaper, which I think still comes out in Israel. And then he was accused of collaborating with the Nazis, abandoning everyone else, like the whole community, for the sake of saving those close to him or whatever. And there was a huge trial because for some weird reason, the Attorney General decided to indict, to go for a lawsuit, yes, a libel suit against the person who wrote this unimportant the accusation was, of course, horrible, but it was written in this really unimportant tabloid. But the Attorney General felt that it cannot be left like that. So he sued the guy, and this turned into this huge trial in 54, 55 in Israel. It was the first time that the Holocaust was actually dealt with in a public way in Israel. And it was as if everyone found a scapegoat to blame for all the horrible things that happened. It's like Galen, the director and producer who made the documentary about my grandfather, which will finally come out in DVD soon enough. No, next month, I hope. She says in the movie, in all the mess, everybody were blaming one another for getting the Nazis altogether. So the trial ended with this title of the judge saying Kastner sold his soul to the devil. Immediately they appealed to the Supreme Court. It took a year and a half, and the Supreme Court cleared his name completely But by that time, he was already dead because he was assassinated by 3 young Israelis who had nothing to do with the Holocaust, but were totally incited, because this became a political war between right and left, because extreme right-wingers saw Kastner as the opportunity to bring down David Ben-Gurion and his party and his government, because they made they thought that Kastner collaborating with the Nazis is equal to David Ben-Gurion collaborating with the British occupation. So he had to be punished, and Kastner was the way to punish him. So that's what I mean by saying doing things differently. To this day, Kastner is considered, to a certain extent, controversial. I mean, the survivors that are still living in Israel have been trying for ages to call a street after him, in vain. I mean, still there will be people who will object to this because he's this huge traitor. But still, for me, it was always, I mean, I have always known of Kastner. For me, there was no moment in which I found out about it. It's like it was always there. And my mother, who was 11 years old when he was assassinated, always sort of brought us up with this notion that we should know that he did this great and such an important thing, and that he was such a hero, that he became really very soon a role model.
You know, I hadn't realized the connection before. Is this the reason that one of your first 2 bills has to do with Holocaust survivors?
Maybe subconsciously.
Yeah, yeah. So you talk about this story in your family. It's sort of embedded in your DNA as a sign that you were part of a founding dynasty, but one that was just outside the mainstream. So how does that now affect the way that you want to act and what you want to achieve in the Knesset?
I don't know if that has to do with what I want to achieve, because what I want to achieve, I want to have a better society. I want to live in a state that has a society that is more equal and is good for everyone. I want to think of the common good. I want to think of equality of all sorts, just like, you know, as opposed to the different inequalities I mentioned before. I want to live in a state that is peaceful. I want to have peace. I want to do justice with every part of the society, with every individual and every community. I don't know if it has to do with my legacy, but and I know it sounds very big, and of course God is in the details, and there are many small things that, and then there are many things that have to do with economy, with security, with legislation that has to do with constitution. That's very funny, I'm on the one of my committees is the Constitutional Law Committee, when Israel, as you may know, does not have a constitution yet. If we ever, nobody guarantees that we ever will have a constitution. So, but these are I know it sounds very big, and I hope it doesn't sound too presumptuous, but yes, this is what I want to work for.
So you talk about this society in your maiden speech, but then you talk also about that it's not enough just to talk about social justice and equality. When you're privileged, and you see to some degree Israel as a privileged country, that means that you need to take responsibility for those who don't have as much. And you spoke about, if I may just quote one sentence, you said, in Israel, everyone is fighting over who's more deprived, who suffers more. This is, of course, a Jewish state, so who's the most wretched, who's the bigger victim? And as this competition over victimhood intensifies, so too does the incitement against competing victims. And you even linked this to the sort of rise of this theme from last year's election of sharing the burden. I thought it was fascinating the way you noted that those who are asking that the burden be shared are really the ones who are in generally the most privileged position in society. Can you explain that a little bit more to us?
I don't know if everyone here followed so closely the equal burden theme of, and it wasn't really of the elections, it was by one person, Yair Lapid, the head of the party that is, what did I say, Yair Lapid? Did I say Yair Lapid? Because I was afraid I said Yair Atid, Yesh Lapid, no. It's Yesh Atid with Yair Lapid. It was his theme, and it's almost his personal agenda, because, I mean, he's not the one who invented it. There were some, actually 2 organizations who were, and there were already appeals to the Supreme Court many times in the past regarding the fact that ultra-Orthodox youngsters are not compelled to go to the army. What happened was that David Ben-Gurion, in the beginning of the State of Israel, gave permission to have 400 yeshiva boys that will be discharged from the army in order to be able to just sit and study the whole day. Now that, of course, you know, the population grew, and that specific population maybe even a little bit more. And now it's about thousands and thousands of young people who do not go to the army. But what happened is that the state at some point made this link between going to the yeshiva and not going to the army. Now, over 66 years, when they were allowed to be segregated and to frighten their youngsters from the army, to frighten them from the general society in general.
The rabbis were doing this.
Of course, the leadership, the specific ultra-Orthodox leadership. And what happened was that they were allowed by the state not to go to the army as long as they go to the yeshiva. Now, I don't know how many of you ever studied in the yeshiva, but it is not an easy thing to do. It requires certain abilities, and it requires a certain character. And it's really not an easy thing to study from morning to night, Talmud and Gemara and Mishnah and all of those things, which are actually quite complicated. So what happens is that they cannot afford to not go to a yeshiva, because then they will be half, sort of exiled from their community. But they can't afford to go to the army also, because they will be exiled, and because they're afraid of the army. So they're just sitting in a yeshiva, not necessarily studying at all, but they can't go to work. And if they do work, they cannot, they have to do it like under the table, because they can't pay taxes, and it cannot be reported, because then they will have to go to the army. So it became this mess. And this became like Yair Lapid's big issue, an equal burden. Now, what happens is that these young people are, first of all, belong to a very, unfortunately, poor community. They are, socioeconomically speaking, really in the lowest status in Israel. And they do not have the same free choice that the average Israeli would have, as limited as, free choice is for each and every one of us. And I would argue that a secular boy that has, yes, it's a mandatory draft. And first of all, it's a mandatory draft for women too. And the amazing thing was that Orthodox women were discharged they are discharged by law. The law says that everyone has to go to the army, but Orthodox women who feel that they cannot serve because of their religious belief, they are discharged automatically. And there was never, ever any cry out or protest on behalf of women, secular women, saying, why am I giving 2 years of my life and they are not? Somehow, even though there is such inequality, overwhelming inequality towards women within the army, Secular women have never complained to a lack of equal burden. But those who are the most privileged, Yair Lapid is like really one of the most privileged people in Israel, famous, rich, with the best upbringing possible, and his mates in his, which is all very well, demanding that someone shares the burden with them, when the truth of the matter is that the burden should be shared. I mean, they are the ones who should share their wealth, their options, their opportunities, their access to anything and everything in Israel with those other underprivileged. So there was something totally twisted about this demand on their behalf. By the way, it ended in a very bad legislation that will create, that first of all will not really make a difference in the numbers of ultra-Orthodox that will be drafted, but that will enlist, but will create designated units for ultra-Orthodox in the army, which I think is more dangerous for the army, the IDF, than having less people enlist. And will also mean that there will be areas which, and the law says so, will be sterile of women, because the ultra-Orthodox guys cannot see, not as much as see women around them. And that is something that the law states today. So I think the damage done by this legislation is so much bigger than whatever good it can possibly bring, that again, it goes to show you who's now sharing the burden of inequality within the army, who's now sharing the burden of some more exclusion of women and the legitimacy that it has.
So you were elected last year with a record number of women, but we're still talking about a minority of women in the Knesset, although I think it's larger percentage than we have in our Congress.
It's nuanced. Yeah, we are 27 out of 120. That's 23 or 24%.
And I think we're now up to a big 20% here. But it was interesting to me, Merav, when I remember speaking with you about this last year, and you were saying that you were going to start a women's caucus. And I guess what was interesting to me is that even with fewer numbers in our Congress, there is this sense of the women sort of banding together. And I'm wondering, why did you want to start this, and what has happened since?
Okay. Women members of Knesset have been working together always. And there was the Knesset during the 90s when we had Nomi Chazan and Yael Dayan and Zahava Gal'on and really amazing members of Knesset. It was an extremely feminist Knesset. They brought about amazing and super important change for women. So it's not like the first time that members of Knesset will be working together. And actually, I think today there's so much cooperation between female members of Knesset, whereas in your Congress, when I asked Congresswoman Jackie Spears how they cooperate on both sides of the aisle, she said, we don't. She said, maybe we can do something about safety seats for babies. Maybe this is like best case scenario. Where in Israel today, there's a lot of cooperation. By the way, there's a lot of cooperation. We have too many aisles today in Israel. It's very fractioned. We have, I don't know, about 14 maybe parties in the Knesset, which is, some would argue, is too much. But there's a lot of cooperation in general. Sometimes I think there's so much cooperation. I mean, I can find myself, you mentioned my inaugural speech, so the person who came up to the stand to congratulate me afterwards, and I asked him to, is Moshe Gafni, member of Knesset from Agudat Israel, the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi party. And I cooperate with him a lot, just as well as I work with both women and men from right-wing parties who really on the political levels are so, it's like another universe for me. But on social issues, we can often cooperate, or on women's issues like feminism in the narrow aspect of it, they would be my immediate allies. So I think even in terms of, as a voter, I think it would get you very confused sometime. Too much cooperation. But just to say, the thing is that the caucus, we have in the Knesset something that is called the Committee for the Status of Women, and now it is headed by Aliza Lavi, member of Knesset Aliza Lavi, and she now added to the name the words gender equality. This is where women's issues and feminist issues are being discussed. This is the public sort of platform for it. The caucus is sort of a members of Knesset club for us in order to empower ourselves, in order to be able to have arguments about feminist issues inside, because I think we still can't have them outside, because it still looks like we're throwing mud at each other or trying to rip each other's eyes out. If women, dare to argue about something, immediately it looks like a cat fight. So, and it's working. We have, are you guys using WhatsApp? Yeah, so we have a group on WhatsApp for all the female members of Knesset, and sometimes, so we let each other know that something's happening, and that, we invite each other and we tell them, can you come now, because we really need that. So it's meant to enhance the cooperation, and also to make us, that there will be, I wanted a place where we can be a majority, where I can feel a part of a majority, not a minority.
So it took you, I think, a year of a lot of hard lobbying, but you now have earned a spot on the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee.
Right from the start.
Right from the start?
Yes, of course.
So
it took me a lot of lobbying and insisting, but from the start, yes.
How many women are on that committee?
4 out of 30.
4 out of 30. Ah.
Think about it. 30 members of Knesset are members of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. That is 1/4 of the Knesset. It's incredible. And only 4 of us are women. And in fact, I am the only female member of Knesset who actually come to all the meetings, because the rest are Zehava Galon. She's now head of a party, so she has a lot of things to do. Miri Regev is the head of the Domestic Affairs Committee, so she's too busy to come most of the time. And the 4th one is Gila Gamliel, who's also apparently busy. So I am always the only female member. It's amazing. How can you not? I mean, and also when really the conflict is something that defines Israel and defines on so many levels and is so prominent and crucial to our existence there. And if I want to be, really, if my wishes is to change the state I'm living in and the society I'm living in, how can I not be on this committee?
So what's it like? What's the conversation like, especially when you're the only woman in the room?
I think it's different only when I ask questions. First of all, because I'm a woman and I didn't come from, I served in the army, but I served in the IDF radio station, so hardly combat. So I have like permission to not know certain things, which the men, even if they don't know, can't afford to ask. So it's very funny, because often when the generals would say something, I would stop them and ask, what does it mean? Or like, because they would say like, all kinds of initials and stuff, which it's like this military language. And there would be silence in the room, because the men also don't know, but they would never ask. So, and then the generals reply, and then there's this relief. There's a sigh of relief. And it's very obvious that when like the generals do their presentations, and then you go around the room and everyone, is giving their comments. So it's very obvious that most of the men on the committee were in the army to some extent. They were like low-ranking or high-ranking generals. And some of them are former security ministers. So they would usually add what they think, or they would give grades. I mean, they would agree and maybe disagree a little bit, whereas I will ask questions again. So it's a very, very different dynamic. That's very, interesting to see. But it'll take time to really create a different dynamic, and to really create a different conversation. It's something that's going to take me much more than a year, even though it's starting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we've been following here, of course, what's happened with the negotiations sponsored by Secretary of State Kerry.
You mean what's not happening?
Yes. What's your analysis, Merav? Why do you think that the talks ended the way they did? Was it what you wanted to see happen? Was it justified?
I will say, first of all, like the obvious, the disclaimer that I wasn't there and I don't know what was in the room or in the rooms or what they discussed or didn't discuss. I will tell you that I knew for quite some time, even before the negotiation started, that Prime Minister Netanyahu wants a negotiation. I think also today he has this he's like off the hook because of the reconciliation with Hamas. So it's like, and the Americans accept that this is getting him off the hook. So it's not a problem for him. But as long as there wasn't reconciliation, he really wanted to have a negotiation. And the reason is because if you divide, traditionally you divide Israelis into one-staters and two-staters, then Netanyahu is a status quoer. He doesn't want one state, for sure. He said he was made to say two states once, but he doesn't really want a Palestinian state, and he really doesn't want to deal with maybe evacuating settlements, and he really doesn't want to deal with anything that he considers to be a risk security-wise. So and the only way to achieve the maintenance of the status quo is to have a negotiation. Because if you don't, if you're negotiating, then you're negotiating. No one can tell you anything, you're negotiating. But the minute you don't, then things may happen. The Palestinians may go to the UN, maybe get like the next step, recognition of a state. Maybe the EU will issue some kind of sanctions on Israel. Things may happen, and then, this may push us to a corner. So I think also today it's in Netanyahu's interest. I mean, again, I said now there is no problem, because unfortunately the West instead of demanding from the Palestinians that they the union recognizes Israel and accepts everything that they already signed and agreed to in the past and continue from that point, everybody agrees that Hamas is not this sort of makes it not legit, and there's nothing to talk about. My problem is that I understand that it's in my interest as an Israeli, it's in Israel's interest to end the conflict and to have an agreement. I am not responsible for the Palestinians. I do not want to guess if Abbas is really a partner or not really a partner, and I will quote one of my ex-generals who says, you don't ask if he's a partner, you make him into a partner. Because as you mentioned in the beginning, we are the strong part. We don't take responsibility for it. Israel is an extremely strong state, safer than it ever was, able of doing so many things, and there is so much that everyone can benefit economically, socially, in every possible way from collaborating with our neighbors. And there's already so much cooperation happening on the ground, that to some extent the Arabs have a saying, min al-mustafid. Whenever something happens that you don't understand why it's happening, check out who's benefiting from it. So I sometimes think that too many people are benefiting from the situation as it is, that it makes it so stuck. Because really, so much cooperation, both economically, both in the third sector, the civil society, so much cooperation with Palestinians. It's so doable, it's so possible.
So now what's going to happen? There's talk about unilateral withdrawal from certain places. What do you get a sense of what's going to happen?
First of all, I'm happy that you mentioned that, but it is incredible. Netanyahu, this is his third term as prime minister. He has never presented any political plan, any political option. He's always been against everything that was presented in the past. Never did he come up with a plan of his own. And the chair of my party, Bougie Herzog, the chair of Labor, when the reconciliation occurred, he said, I, as prime minister, would first and foremost show my lines. What are my guidelines? What am I willing to, as Israel, want to achieve and just, do what I need to do to get there, in order to get there. I think the unilateral move is not the best choice, but it's probably better than where we are now. Again, you asked, is it justified that there is no negotiation, that the negotiations have failed? I, for one, believe that it's all about political will. Now, there has not been a political will. I don't want to talk about the Palestinians. I'm not responsible for the Palestinians. I can tell you that in Israel, there hasn't been political will to reach an agreement since Yitzhak Rabin. And Barak did not have a political will to solve this. He wanted all kinds of things, but not to reach an agreement. When when you want to reach an agreement, it can't be about your ego, about being right. It's got to be about the agreement that you want to reach. This, unfortunately, is the thing that's missing. Will there be political will even for a unilateral move and step? I doubt it too, because again, the sort of so-called price, which again, I don't think that this is a price. I think that the thing that is happening to us now is much more of a price than having to evacuate some of the settlements. I don't know if you've been following the protest last week with David Nachlai, that soldiers put on Facebook signs saying, I identify with David Nachlai.
Do you know what this story is? It's really fascinating. There was a soldier in Hebron who was accused of badly interrogating a Palestinian boy there. And his fellow IDF members challenged the hierarchy using social media.
Yes.
It's the first time this has really happened in that way.
True, they were hiding their faces, taking their pictures with signs saying, I identify with David Nachlai, I am with David Nachlai, hiding their faces. And this is, to me, the number one worry. This is dangerous. This is something that is threatening the IDF inside the IDF. It's not only about the society anymore. It's not only about how polarized and how tensed is the society, but when it starts happening within the army, then you have to realize that it's impossible to keep the IDF as the policeman of the territories, having Palestinians and settlers fighting all the time.
Well, that's one of the criticisms, that these young men and women who go into the IDF are trained for military combat, but in fact, mostly what they're doing in the territories is police work, which is very different. Is that right?
Of course, and it makes them less ready for combat, because the army is very much engaged and a lot of its money, time, energy goes for whatever it needs to do in the territories. It's also one of the problems in maintaining the conflict.
Merav, you speak Arabic. Are there many other Knesset members who do, especially on the Foreign Affairs Committee?
Well, first of all, there are all the former Shabak people who speak Arabic.
That's the security forces.
Shabak is the secret service that deals with the Arabs. So they, of course, speak Arabic. But the Arabs, they know, first of all, they know those people, the leaders know, and they know to recognize this kind of Arabic. They immediately will tell you, mukhabarat. So there are these, and very few who come from Arab countries originally, and that their parents still spoke with them Arabic at home. Generally speaking, few members of Knesset speak Arabic, not enough.
Where did you learn?
Just with two amazing young women who taught me privately. One of them from from Jaffa, and the other from Nazareth. And just for 7 years, I've been sitting with them twice a week and in the past year, I neglected it horribly. So so thank you for reminding me to get back to it ASAP.
I wondered if you can just bring us up to date on the politics of the Labor Party. When you were elected, Shelley Yachimovich was the head of the party. Now Isaac Herzog, Bougie Herzog, is the head. What happened there, and what do you think about it?
What happened was that Shelley Yachimovich felt that her authority was somehow undermined. I don't know how much that was true, but that is how she felt. So she decided to go for primaries, even though she didn't have to. The constitution of the party allows her to do it up until 3 years after. But she did, and it was her against Bougie Herzog, and he was elected. And this was a very definite, he won by 20%, which is a big gap, of course. And now I think I was against holding those primaries altogether, but once we have now Bougie I supported Bougie. I have to admit it was very difficult for me to support the not woman. No, really, and he's white, Mele, if he was not white, when it was Amir Peretz versus Shelley Yachimovich, then at least you have like the black guy versus the white woman, okay, but white men and white women, and I supported the white male, really, not easy.
Why did you support him?
Because I thought once I was forced to make the choice, that he was more right. Because I think Labor's most important role today, and our biggest responsibility, is to create an alternative for a non-right-wing regime. This is the most important thing that we need to do. Thank you. It's really our responsibility. It's been, Labor has lost so much of its power, a lot due to the fact that it was a partner of too many right-wing governments. And it's time to really do a paradigm shift and to really start rebuilding Israel the way it needs to be built, the way it needs to be designed, the way it really deserves Israelis to live in. And that is what we should work for, and I thought Bougie was more right for this task.
Well, thank you. I'd like to turn the floor over to you now and your questions. So the question is, what percentage of the Israeli population lives in the settlements, and of those people who do live there, what percentage are originally American?
I have no idea how many Americans live there, even though it's probably worth mentioning, or checking if you are bringing it up the way you do. I will say that many people who live, I think the statistics are around 300,000 people.
Sometimes it's more.
Sometimes it's more. It depends what you're counting also, of course, as always. And the population of Israel today is 8 million people, so this is the percentage. But I will say that not too many of them are ideological settlers. Many of them are just people who can find affordable housing in the settlements, and that actually, if you have been following, one of the major issues which were occupying the Israeli, I would say average Israeli, is housing, and the only place which has really housing, affordable housing and new housing really in considerable numbers is the territories. So a lot of people find themselves living there just because this is an option.
So the question is, when the Haredim, when the ultra-Orthodox enter the military, why is there this pressure on the part of the government to insist that they go into combat units rather than into, in essence, community service?
First of all, there is no talk about necessarily combat units. So many of them, there's actually a course for Haredi people who do technical work. They teach them all kinds of technical stuff in the Air Force, and they do that, and it's totally non-combat. So there are many options for them, open for them within the army that's not necessarily combat. Now regarding Shirut Leumi, civil service, the thing is that we do not have, the state of Israel does not have like open slots of civil service for everyone. And I'm not sure that it's not a good thing that it doesn't, because my worry is that if we have all those women and men who do not go to the army doing 2 years of civil service, the implication of that on workers that are being paid below salaries in those non-professional jobs may be very harsh. If you all of a sudden have so much manpower that actually doesn't cost you anything because the government pays them whatever it pays, that may have a devastating effect on too many people in the work world. So I'm not sure that this is a good alternative to make everyone do civil service. And it definitely is not that obvious. It should take serious thinking into and making sure that if you do create such alternative course, it does not hurt the work world in the way that I'm afraid it might.
Thank you. So I guess, Merav, the question would be, how do you characterize the disadvantage of the ultra-Orthodox? You know, in a way, is the government enabling it? Is it chosen? Is this chosen poverty?
Chosen by whom? It goes back to what we talked about, how much... Yes, it goes back to Ben-Gurion. No, but what I mean is, what you were saying is that the government enables it by paying them whatever allowances, even though they're very small and create poverty, still it allows them not to go to work. First of all, there was something in how you presented the things that was as if you were excusing them, like you said, self-imposed and and I think it's my role as the state to enable each and every individual to have as much free choice as they possibly can have, and to be as less subjected to the force that his rabbis are applying on them. And so allowances alone do not allow them to be self-imposing poverty on their community. But there is a lot of cooperation by the state. I agree with you totally. But one of the things is really this link between yeshiva and the army service, as I was mentioning before. I actually think it's a crucial brick that if we were to take out of the wall, saying, I actually know, and Jane knows it, we talked about it. I had an alternative legislation that had to do with Haredi draft. And I said they should be allowed the same freedom of religious belief that women have. Because religious belief is not a gender criteria. I mean, if one feels that due to their religious belief that they cannot serve in the army, something that, by the way, every army in the democratic world allows this kind of discharge, then this should apply also for men as well as for women. And so what would happen is what happens now is that the negotiation between the army and the ultra-Orthodox is communal, whereas every secular citizen, this is a private duty that they have to the state and to the army. And the ultra-Orthodox have it as a community. They give quotas. Who gives quotas? How come? Why don't Tel Aviv start giving quotas? Why don't, I don't know, Mizrahi Jews give quotas, Ethiopians give quotas? It should go back to being an individual negotiation, I would say, between the state and the army, and every individual, no matter if they're Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, secular, and if there are such who cannot serve in the army, for whatever reason, by the way, not only ultra-Orthodox, but also others, they should be allowed to go to be productive and to have their meaningful lives wherever it may be, and not to tie them to the yeshiva and to allow their leaders to self-impose on them whatever lives they should have. So, of course, it's much more complex than that, but as a state, I think I have a lot of responsibility in order not to allow their leadership to maintain the ghetto that they're creating.
So the question was the pros and the cons for the legislation that the Prime Minister is pushing to actually officially designate Israel as a Jewish state.
First of all, we need to remember that this whole Jewish state thing started as a new obstacle for the negotiations. This is what brought up the whole question of a Jewish state. And now it's like coming back to us, I would say haunting us, because I think truly I see no cons in a legislation that says that Israel is a Jewish state. This was, my funny non-husband says, it's as if I would stand up in the room now and say, this shirt that I'm wearing is mine, and you will not tell me any otherwise. It was something that was a given. Everybody, I mean, Israel was a Jewish state. The independence, הצהרת העצמאות, הכרזת העצמאות says so.
The Declaration of Independence.
Thank you. The Declaration of Independence says so, and it has always been that, and it's obvious it is the home of the Jewish people. Why do you need to start negotiating it? I mean, what do you gain from negotiating it?
So this year, for the first time, the ceremony marking the transition from Yom HaZikaron to Yom HaAtzmaut on Har Herzl is going to be done all by women, and apparently there's a controversy about this among some, and the questioner wants to know what you think of it.
Well, there are pros and cons. I think, it's a good thing, of course, that there will be such exposure of the contribution that women had to the state of Israel. I think it's an opportunity to see all of a sudden that, I think even the idea that they actually were able to find 12 women to light the torches may be amazing to some viewers and some citizens and some officials too, I would think. So, but yes, in general, I agree that I would want to see women, I would want to see parity in general. I think that makes all of us here probably, we want to see parity in our daily lives, in the Knesset, in Parliament, in Congress, in the government, in the workplace, at home, mind you, at home. We need to start thinking, or actually rethinking the economy in a way that will give the financial and economical value to what is mostly women's labor, that is the household and child upbringing work, that according to the International Labor Organization, if those labors were counted inside the national accounts, the world GDP would have been 30% bigger. There is a lot of work being done. Nobody acknowledges, recognizes, pays for, gives social security for, pension, etc., etc. So there's a lot of work that we have cut out for us. And I mean, it's a nice gesture, but really, this is not what it's all about. If I may, on that note, just to say that one of the things that I'm working on and that I'm going to be presenting now that Knesset reconvenes is a legislation, a proposal for civil marriage in Israel. It will actually be, yes, I know, it's very relevant in this audience, and I think it's much more relevant within Israel than most Israelis realize. And it will actually be, and it's amazing to recognize that it'll be the first ever proposal, because we have 3 proposals on the table now that are called civil union or whatever, but they're very partial and they offer 2 courses. And that will actually be the first one that talks about civil marriage, period, civil registration by the state, and civil dismantling. We don't even call it a get, because it's not a get, because I don't want it to be a get, because I don't want it to be religious marriage. So if you have any, if you're close to bougie, I urge you to let him know that it should be Labor's agenda. Because I really think that Israelis, and I'm talking now about the ones who make the decisions, not about the general population, even Israeli politicians, I know they visit the States, I know they meet you guys, but somehow they don't get it. Most of Israeli politicians are totally subjected to what the ultra-Orthodox and the Orthodox are telling us. This will be the end of the Jewish people. This will be the end of the state of Israel. If you allow civil marriage, that's it. And secular politicians are practically afraid to go for it. So if you can help people not to be afraid in general, it would be, fear is a very bad guide in life. But if you have any interaction with any Israeli politicians, you can explain to them that you can have civil marriage and still be Jewish, and the world continues, and the Jewish people continues, and it's okay.
Thank you all so much. You can see why it is just such a pleasure and an inspiration to spend time talking and listening to Merav Michaeli. Thank you again, and thanks to everyone who's made the celebration on the Upper West Side for Israel so special.
And thank you, Jane. Thank you very, very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.